it online while observing physical distancing. COVID-19 is still ravaging across the globe. We're close to 4 million cases confirmed and more than 270,000 deaths in 212 countries. Now, any individual practitioner, researcher, city, or country cannot solve this alone. What we need is unprecedented international collaboration, because unlike traditional wars where there are many sides, for COVID-19, there is only one side that we can take, and that is humanity. Now, to facilitate this borderless collaboration and dialogue, the organizers, which includes the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China Relations, China Science Healthcare, Tencent Healthcare, and China Investment Financial Holding, has brought together 6 of us, right, both researchers and practitioners in US and China, for what I would call a virtual fireside chat to reflect on our experiences thus far and what are our concerns as we knowingly or unknowingly move into the normal that we live in today. Now, also, this event would not have been possible without our collaborating partners, Harvard-China Health Partnership, Peking University Education Foundation, the NYU Langone Health, Florence Fang Family Foundation, EMBA International Council, and Tencent Trusted Doctors. So online with us here today is Dr. Zhong Nanshan from China Academy of Engineering, Dr. Stan Verma from Yale School of Public Health, Dr. Zhang Wenhong from Huashan Hospital and Fudan University in Shanghai, Dr. Brian Boswell from NYU Langone Health and Langone Health Tisch Hospital, Dr. Qiao Jie from Peking University Medical School and TKU Hospital in Beijing. But last but not least, we also have Dr. Barry Bloom from Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Now, we observed the first large outbreak of COVID-19 in Wuhan, which as of today has detected, I think, no new cases over the past 4 weeks, which has been quite remarkable. Now, to kick us off today, I would like to ask Dr. Zhong, who spearheaded the China's COVID-19 response, to tell us the strategy to control and actually, more importantly, right, how to prevent the resurgence of COVID-19. Just let me pass the mic to Dr. Zhong.
Okay. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Alex. So, good evening for everybody. Good morning here for everybody. So, I actually am not an expert of public health, but as a clinician, I just make some points for this this evening's topics. So, can I say? 给我调一个。一提升一直想一直好。Sorry, just yes. As I had mentioned here, I would like to take the terminology of prevention. That's the core of the control of the COVID-19 infection. So as you know, so this is data. This is data you just now Alex had mentioned. So that's the yesterday data. About 3.6 million people have been diagnosed with a mortality of 6.9, close to 7%. And here's in China. So the data here. So in the down here. So with the mortality of 5.5%. So it's such a really pandemic all over the world. So the first point I would like to mention about the China strategy in controlling further spreading. So I think that this work is started from an executive committee of the experts here. They announced here. So they announced that's in 20th January. So announced there was a very different human-to-human transmission. This kind of diseases. That's a very important mark, saying that's how contagious it is. So and also that's many staff have been infected. So since then, that's how to deal with this kind of diseases. So I just quote the UK of the model. Everybody will be familiar with this. So the new cases here over time, spring, summer, and autumn. So if we take no any action, that the outbreak will be going up so fast, that out of the control of the so-called national health system capacity, that cause a big problem with that. Lots of lack of beds, lack of medical staff, or lack of materials, and so on. And if we can take some action, just put the down to the or under the capacity, that will be much better. At that time in the UK, they mentioned about isolating individual and social distancing, and for vulnerable, and the whole household isolation if one member is ill. So what happens in China? So actually, out of the measure control that exists a big difference in between countries. So actually, I should say just two steps. One is a really strong control, very strong action. We call that suppression. Another, of course, mitigation. Suppression will be lock down all the things and stop the communication and transportation, all the things. That, of course, will cause a big impact on the economy. And mitigation, it depends on what kind of mitigation you are taking. So I think in China, so we just choose this direction. That's I summarize as four measures. The first is because based on the concept, there's the sentence of there's an outbreak of COVID-19 in China. I think this sentence is not that correct. I think there's an outbreak in Wuhan, in China. I think just one place, so many cities. That's very important based on this kind of evaluation. So that's lockdown Wuhan. That's announced by the central government in 23rd. So don't go to Wuhan and don't leave Wuhan. That's the first. And the second is should make it more transparent of the news of the number of the disease patients every day in each city. And the third is most important is this. It's we call that the so-called for early. So early detection by self-detection, including wearing mask, don't go to the stay at home, don't go to the meeting or something. So early diagnosis and yes, early protection, yes, early protection. There's distancing and wearing one mask, early detection, early diagnosis, and early isolation. So early diagnosis is very important because at that time, in some of the country, they need to be confirmed by the CDC. But in China, so quite early, the government had decided so that the big hospital can make a diagnosis of COVID-19 infection. So that make it much faster to make a diagnosis. Then that's more early down to the community level. And of course, the close contacts, including those without symptoms, should receive a PCR checkup. So this is happening in Wuhan at that time. On that day, I'm not going to talk too much about that. So what happens of the newly diagnosed patient over time here? So you can see. So that's the new diagnosed patient is getting up. So 2 weeks to the 2 weeks here. So the middle of February, that to the peak. That's 1 day. So close to 400 patients in newly diagnosed. The number is reaching the peak, and then it's going down. So 2 weeks time going down. Altogether, it just took 1 week to control the spreading. So we can make a comparison. So global daily news and here. So this is happening in early January and then February in China. That's the curve. And then at the beginning of March, here some other countries so have some outbreak. So Spain, Italy, Germany, and France, and so on. And this is United States. So going up very fast. So it just took 1 month and here, so 1 month, 6 weeks. Still, some of the countries still in a high level. So this is we had such a situation. I think the very core control transmission, distancing, simply saying distancing. When you have a meeting and join together, so you should wear mask. It's just preventing the people to, in fact, to transmit to you rather than you are sick and wearing mask to prevent yourself to transmit to others. So this is the thing. So recently, I have no data from the whole country, and just you can see in Guangdong province, which is have 100 million population in Guangdong. That's in my city where I work. I'm in here. So there's some data. So you can see recently the more importation coming. So that's a big problem to us. So of course we need to have more to open, to have more communication and transportation, and that causes much more import cases. How can we deal with this? That was the problem. So actually that's a big challenge of the government's policy. How to keep a balance between reopen and lockdown. So as you know, so if you totally reopen, then of course we recover. We can't develop. But actually, on the other hand, we will increase the risk of this pandemic. So that's one point. If you go into the other part, so totally locked down, protect from further infection, will cause a great impact of the economic development, even to make some impact on the survival of the people. So no income cannot live. So that will be a big problem. As I mentioned, the big challenge, the government policy. So when in China, first is trying to lock down Wuhan city, and then now is trying to reopen step by step. That's the policy of that. That's really difficult. For all the country will be facing this kind of problem. So that's second point I would like to mention about herd immunity. As you know, there are 2 points, of course, of ideas thinking about that. Of course, as at the beginning, in the brief, I mentioned natural infection without any intervention. So like some smallpox and some others, even influenza. But of course, influenza, the mortality, much less than COVID-19 infection. But if you this to get the herd immunity, actually, from the general knowledge, will have 60 to 70% of people being infected. But if we will take the more sacrifice of the people, so if we calculate this this population, that will be, I think, will be 45 million people die globally. That's great loss of the life. So I don't think in China we'll think that. That the other way, for the majority of these countries, will think about massive vaccination. So it really needs time to complete this. So 1 to 1.1 year at least, maybe. So we really need a global collaboration, in particular in between China and the United States. So actually now in China, there are 3 kinds of vaccines on the way. It's going into clinical trial. One is mRNA, and that's similar to the States vaccine, this Chinese Academy of Military Medical Science. And then 2 inactivated vaccine. One is by Wuhan, and another one is in Beijing. So that's published yesterday in Science. Rapid development of inactivated vaccine candidate for COVID-19. this is a data. I'm not going to talk to create higher antibody and have a the virus titles going down and so on. I'm not going to talk too much about that. So the last one I'd like to say, once the patient got infected and got symptoms, well, we also need to have a very strong idea in moving. We have to make the other intervention. So because the majority of the patient will be in mild or moderate status. So the most majority will be recovered under healthcare, general healthcare. That will be okay. So in China, it's quite a lot of people just take some Chinese herb. So we call that 连婚亲温胶囊. The data will be published very soon. So this is, I'm not going to talk too much about it. This shows some efficacy in terms of high overall recovery and faster symptom recovery and higher rate of improvement of CT. However, there's no significant difference in completion rate to severe cases or virus conversion time. That's although there are some tendency, so didn't show significant difference. But anyway, this kind of reduce the symptoms and make the patient recover earlier. That's good. That's only 5. And another 15 of the so-called severe patients will have the idea in mind. So we should have some effective and cheaper, in particular in developing countries, should have some cheaper medication to prevent from further deterioration of this kind of patients. So we just take two examples. So just developed recently from my group. One is using recombinant granulocyte colony stimulating factor. This is quite a general agent. That's in dealing with this patient with lymphopenia, because lymphovenous is correlated to the high risk of mortality. So we have 200 patients. In those patients with severe lymphopenia, and of course without comorbidity. So in those patients, we should use these. So recombinant GCSF, and we have a rapidly shortened time to clinical recovery, and also markedly lower the proportion of patients with progression and die in treatment group. So that's a very simple treatment. That's a very it's available for the developing country as well as for the world. So this is a new data we just summarized at the moment. Another one is the hydrogen or oxygen inhalation. As you know, 30, 40 years ago, that's helium oxygen inhalation, the same, to relieve dyspnea. But now we have developed a very simple machine, just change the weather into hydrogen and oxygen gas, and then to treat the patient. So the result, did show a rapid and sustained improvement of the clinical symptoms, in particular dyspnea. So this finding was still valid in patients with different severity categories. And this is so we should use some simple method to prevent those patients from developing critical ill situation, because critical ill situation that the mortality will be pretty high, close to 50%. So at the moment, so this is what I mentioned very briefly as a clinician, saying we should pay more attention to prevention, prophylaxis, of course. So that's why one role, one fight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Zhong, for sharing with us. And it is clear that at the beginning, and we are still trying to actually figure this out, how to actually manage COVID-19 clinically for the inpatients. But I think a point you mentioned quite well is that for us to actually manage this going forward, we need to somehow develop herd immunity. And of course, the best way to do it is with mass vaccination, but it will take time and a lot of effort across the world to develop an effective vaccine, but as well as natural protection. I think I'll come back to all of you. With a natural infection and seropositivity actually equates to protection, because that is actually one of the many unanswered questions that we will have. Now, actually, for this, right, I would like to now ask Stan to share with us. Now, Dr. Zhong has shared with us what has happened, I guess, in China over the last few months with some of these measures, and the US is still in the heat of the moment right now, right? What is sort of your perspective from your vantage point, Stan?
First of all, I'd like to congratulate our Chinese friends for the remarkable public health efforts and clinical work that has resulted in nearly a month of COVID-free status. And this is something we envy, because our epidemic is still the world's largest and it continues to rage. Here in Connecticut, we are not very far from New York City. So there was a wave of infection that sort of came up our highway and our train line and caused a tremendous wave of infection. In our hospital, our city is only 130,000 people, but we have had over 400 patients at any time for the past several weeks. And only the past couple of days has it been under 400. But we still have 100 people in the intensive care unit and 70 of them on ventilators. So these are all historic highs. We've never had so many people requiring ventilators in our small city. We are seeing a decline. We seem to have peaked, and we are seeing a decline. And there is much activity in our state to discuss how to reopen the state. But the state lacks a number of criterion. First of all, we have not had 14 days of consistent downward trend, which the federal government guides us to suggest that only then should you contemplate a reopening. Similarly, we are not capacitated for contact tracing, and testing is still limited. So we have a long way to go. Now, our state government is working diligently with some success to expand testing. We have a volunteer program with over 400 volunteers at the Yale School of Public Health that is doing contact tracing for 2 of our larger cities in the state. And that's going well, but it's not going to cover the needs for the entire state. We are sure that we're going to need the physical distancing for months to come that Professor Zhong has highlighted for us. We're also going to need the hand hygiene and face hygiene with soap and water or with the hand sanitizers. We have now begun aggressive mask use, and this took a lot longer than it should have. We know from our friends in Asia that masks have been in use for many years to combat air pollution. And it's kind of almost the norm in large Chinese cities to use masks. But it took a long time for that to become normative in our country. And even today, I was going out for a walk. I had my mask, and I came to our local high school, and young sportswomen, teenagers were sitting around, not physically distanced, not with masks. And I feel that many Americans are not yet disciplined to stick with these reasonable precautions. We have many clinical trials, over 120 of them in the US, for a variety of drugs. We're hoping that drugs can come along quickly compared to vaccines. We've been working on an HIV vaccine for 35 years without success. And the fastest vaccine that I'm aware of was the one developed in Philadelphia for mumps. It took us about 4 years. Now, it is plausible with this global partnership and 90 products that have been identified, at least 7 are in clinical trials, that a product from China, a product from Europe, a product from the US, somewhere, we will have some success, and we hope that that can be brought to scale. But I think it's improbable that we would have a serious number of vaccines, knowing that they're safe and knowing that they're effective, before a couple of years. And that would be if everything goes just perfectly. We do also have the priority in the US of trying to reopen our economy. Much health damage is done when you lose your job. What if you own a small business and it goes bankrupt? What if you are working for a large business and that goes bankrupt? So we know that there is harm in closing the economy, and a thoughtful, measured approach. For example, something that 7 governors of 7 of our states in the Northeast are working together, collaborating. And this is very wise, because from Massachusetts down to Delaware, we are one coherent block in our country, and we're connected very well by roads and airplanes and rail travel. So it's foolish for our states to be operating in isolation. And the fact that the governors are coordinating well, one of our faculty, Albert Coe, is co-chairing our state's advisory group and will represent the state in the 7-state group. And that's a good sign. That's a logical, science-driven, metric-driven approach to reopening the economy. And I think Professor Zhang said it very well. This is a global partnership. I will end by just telling you a story. Our friends at Zhejiang School of Public Health called me and said, would you like us to have a telephone conference with some of your COVID researchers and clinical leaders, and we can share with you the Chinese experience? And I said, this is utterly delightful. This is fantastic. This was about 6 weeks ago. And we were just seeing our first cases. So we had a very valuable exchange where our Chinese friends presented to us their experience battling COVID, both on the public health and on the clinical side. And we were so impressed that our Chinese friends would reach out to guide us in this way. And we were so grateful that we are now doing the same for our African colleagues. And we've had symposia now with Uganda and Burkina Faso and Senegal and Sudan, and we have Cameroon coming up, a number of other countries. So we're trying to do a favor for our African friends, just as our Chinese friends did for us. So again, congratulations with the progress you've made. And I know that all of you are hoping for the very best in the United States as we try to have the kind of public health and social discipline that you had that was able to control your epidemic.
Well, thank you very much, Stan. So I've been in Connecticut, so beautiful city, and then I think 20 years ago. So I think I really appreciate how much effort you have made. So I really know what the situation in the United States at the moment. So the whole world, the whole COVID-19 infection cannot be controlled. So if one country is still in a very high and is still increasing, so the whole world not be controlled. So no matter how well China has done, so that's no way. So for really control of the COVID-19 infection. So I quite agree with your point. So the global collaboration is really necessary. So one thing you had mentioned, So I suppose the tracing close contact is still very important. I think in Wuhan, one of the very important is setting up some hospital. Just try to separate the healthy person and or symptomatic patient. So separate them to reduce further infection. That's most important. In terms of wearing mask, you can. So it depends on if you have some meeting and small room, and so you have to have a mask. Very important. If you take a jogging in the outside, that's no problem. Not wearing mask. It depends. So I suppose wearing mask is really important because so far, as you know, the general wear is about 0.5 millimeters. That's impossible to prevent the coronavirus per se getting into the mask. But however, the COVID-19 virus cannot freely in the air. It must attach something. So in particular droplets. So droplets can, of course, the mask can prevent droplets. So that's most important. So that's what I mentioned. So you have made a great effort. I suppose in Connecticut, it's going to the plateau, maybe. So we'll be going on, I hope, in some days. That will be very important. That's a different culture in China and the United States. As you know, in the citizens of China, so how poor they are, but they still some deposit, some money keep it at home, so they can survive. However, in the United States, quite a big number of people, they just depend on their daily or their weekly or monthly income. And then after running out, they have to work. So that's different. So I suppose they should, you have done a good job. I really hope that the situation in the state will be getting much better in the next few weeks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Yeah, as Stan, as you mentioned, right, I think this is, while we are here sort of talking across the Pacific Ocean, I mean, all the progress we have made here today, whether it's actually in Wuhan and Beijing or actually in New Haven, could not have been possible without the efforts of the front line. Now, I would like to ask Dr. Zhang Wenhong, who is actually in Shanghai, now a population of 25 million people, right? Dr. Zhang, how did Shanghai manage to contain and control COVID-19? What has been your experiences on the ground, Dr. Zhang?
Okay. Hello, everyone. And it's my great pleasure for me to have the opportunity to exchange our viewpoints with all our colleagues in China and the United States. Previously, just like Professor Zhong mentioned that China, almost all the city, we take some similar strategies, except for Wuhan. For me, as a leader of the COVID-19 expertise group in Shanghai, the city with 30 million people here, actually we started the combat against the COVID-19 in late January. I remember that I went to the designated hospital on January 20th. And our experience is mainly today, I can say that we mainly concentrated on three key elements. We took aggressive testing and extensive tracing and the maximum hospitalizations. Actually, we calculated the ICU beds previously. We compared the ICU beds, capacity of the ICU beds with that in New York City. I think if there's outbreak in Shanghai, actually, I have a greater concern about the overwhelming patients with this critical ill. So therefore, we had to take very strict measures in the very early stage. So actually, like Wuhan, I think is totally different from that in Shanghai. The Wuhan, just like Professor Zhong mentioned, it's a epicenter of China and with rapid growth of the epidemics. So therefore, the strict measures should be taken to control the local transmission. While in regions where epidemic burden is relatively lighter, just like in Shanghai, I think the more focus should be put on early diagnosis and treatment and trying to find all the patients to stop the local transmission. In China, for instance, as Wuhan, we know that it's with the rapid progress of the plague. So we know that they took the strict lockdown, including traffic control with the city, and the province border were also temporarily closed. But today we know that after 2 months, just on April 8th, China reopened Wuhan again. So therefore, the strict social distancing and the stay-at-home regulations were carried out in Wuhan. Actually, it's very hard to break the economic there. However, the duration is very short, just 2 months. And such method were only possible, I think, if we took a very strict method there. We should take another accompanying strategies, just like we will do the strong community support. For example, in the Wuhan city, the fresh food, vegetables, and the fruits were delivered door to door by the community works, and the other life necessity will also be delivered if asked. So therefore, I think the community support is one of the biggest advantage in China, because we have a lot of community workers, and also we have lots of community volunteers. Just like we in China, almost 50,000 healthcare workers also went there, and also I think the countless volunteers went there to help the community to do the jobs I just mentioned. Shanghai, of course, is totally different. We are in the center with a lighter epidemic here. I think we have to take the very early epidemic, very early and lighter epidemic burden here. So therefore, we to control the imported cases from Wuhan. Shanghai government took a more lighter control measures. So actually, we did not take the strict shutdown here. We just asked our citizens stay at home, but not mandatory. And the citizens also, they could go out for food, shopping banks, hospitals, and etc. And all life necessary facilities here remained open for normal life. So instead, the Shanghai government also, we took the massive effort in aggressive COVID testing. So we took the aggressive COVID testing at a very early stage, just at the end of January. We also, our CDC staff compared with the community work, the tracing for every house context, close contacts. So the home quarantine of close contacts were carried out thoroughly with the assistance of community primary care physicians and the social works. So timely and extensive testing through tracing of every patient and the home quarantine of the close contacts of the suspected population is very crucial, as according to my experience in the prevention and the control of the COVID-19. So therefore, the timely diagnosis protocol and the timely quarantine measure here effectively stopped it. We also, of course, we did not cause the strategy did not cause the overwhelming impact on the normal citizen life. So I think we took every measure very early in the early stage of the epidemic of this disease. It's very, very important. So in Shanghai, of course, recently we still face a great challenge of the imported cases. So therefore, recently we set up a network of nearly 300 fever clinics and fever sentinel hospitals. We just want to collect all the samples from suspected cases in the future. So all suspected patients met with the criterion and could be tested freely here and were admitted to hospital in the quarantine ward. So in every hospital, we have a quarantine ward just to quarantine the suspected cases. So I think the above three elements just what we took in our city to control the disease. So recently, actually, we have already reopened the city for almost 3 months, and no further local cases detected here in recent to several months. So in the next few months, just as Professor Zhong mentioned, we reopen the city and we will face the challenge of the imported cases, and the world and they're also very eager to reopen the business and the society. So I think in the coming next months, Europe and the United States will reopen the board. So therefore, I believe that it's highly likely that we might be living with the COVID instead of eradicating it in our country. So I do not think we should keep the 0 cases here. So I think the great challenge here we are all facing is still very great. And how should the world cope with the new society under the shadow of the COVID epidemics? I think is a very important issue for all of us. So we will return to the new normal. So in the near future, we will face the challenge of the imported cases. I think it's very important for us to take some more measures in the next stage. Thank you all. Yeah, thank you.
No, thank you, Dr. Chang. It seems like Shanghai has taken a similar approach to what Dr. Zhong mentioned, right, Israel. Early protection, early detection, early diagnosis, and early isolation. Now, some has referred to New York as the Wuhan of China. Being the epicenter of the outbreak in the US, Brian, how is NYU prepared for this, right? And what is it like on the ground right now?
So, I think what was so valuable is learning from the early experiences coming out of Wuhan. And as soon as the reports came out, we mobilized our emergency management and enterprise resilience group and began having daily meetings at the very beginning throughout the month of January, as we were following very closely what was happening in Wuhan and then in the other cities in China, both on the measures that they were taking and the preparations for what was to come. And so we created a very detailed script within the hospital about what we would do when we first saw a patient in New York City, what that would do and what measures we would take, and then when we first had a positive patient in our hospital. In part, we were hampered by testing, and I think that's a story that certainly has played out in a number of other cities. And it wasn't until we had our own in-house test, which took a good week or two to really get up and running, that we were able to have an idea of the magnitude. But once the patients started coming in, it didn't matter to us actually what their test showed, because the syndrome of COVID-19 that they were presenting with was reproduced, and the hypoxemia and all of that. So we very quickly, once we had our first patient, cleared out a whole floor of the hospital. And then we're planning on basically every 12 hours what the next move was going to be and how we could reshape our institution to be able to first move all of the non-COVID positive patients to other locations. And then very quickly, the entire building was overwhelmed with the patients. And we transformed one of our towers into ICUs. And we increased our ICU capacity 11-fold. So at our peak, we had 196 ICU patients, and today we're down to under 100, down to the low 90s, which is terrific. And we have about as many patients who are positive on the regular floors as well. And in order to do that transformation, in addition to the physical plant, we needed essentially an army of people to come in and take care of them. And the normal operations of the hospital, both the surgical procedures, transfers, elective procedures, and all the other medical diagnoses that usually come in, turned off, and the entire population was infected with coronavirus. And so we used trainees from other departments. We used a whole slew of volunteers from both within New York State and really from around the country who were flying into New York to help care for these patients. And that was really an incredible outpouring that we saw as we were really trying to just take care of the never-ending stream of patients that were coming through. As we had these volumes of patients, there were a lot of clinical observations that really did occur. Certainly, recognition of the hypercoagulability and the clotting, the need for increased access to renal replacement therapy, dialysis, continuous renal replacement therapy, peritoneal dialysis for acute kidney injury, and then really having to mobilize and create new teams to be able to focus on particular problems that those patients had, both related to the dialysis as well as some of the ventilatory management. So whole teams coming in and proning patients, teams coming in and doing regular bronchoscopy to do deep suctioning to remove some of the mucus plugs that were really affecting a lot of the patients severely. And throughout all of that, I think in order to try to attack the problem, we needed that close collaboration between the individuals and the teams in our hospital, as well as within our system and within the city. And so the 5 major hospital systems within New York had daily calls at the senior leadership level, the CEOs of the institutions, the chief medical officers, the medicine chairs, to try to share ideas and figure out ways that would really best be able to take care of those patients. Because there was such a strong psychological toll that the numbers of patients and the severity of illness really took on all of the different staff members, it was important to really do a lot to try to both keep up morale, to celebrate the victories, the patients who were successfully discharged, those that were able to be transitioned out of the ICU back to the regular floor. And that, I think, is an important component to the response, really making sure that we pay attention not just to the physical health of the patients, but the psychological health and safety of the caregivers. And we spent a lot of time working on that. When we discharged our 1,000th patient, and we had seemed like the entire hospital filling the lobby to watch her leave, and it was quite a dramatic and striking moment. And that type of care really needs to be paid attention to. And the other piece that I think also was very inspirational in the caring for patients was that with all of the different teams that were coming in, we graduated our medical students early, about 6 weeks, longer than that, 2 months earlier than their normal graduation date. And they volunteered to come in and work on the floors. And seeing these newly minted students come on was a source of pride. And it showed that their education wasn't just about pathophysiology and taking care of disease, but it was about being a physician and really instilling in them the ethics of a profession. And you have to rush in to take care of those who are in need. And that also was a point that was truly energizing to the entire staff. What I think one of the struggles is going to be is maintaining that. And so we're past the peak, but we're certainly not at the nadir. And so we're coming down in both of our ICU numbers, the number of new admissions. It's not a uniform drop. And so just like Stan was saying, we haven't had 14 consecutive days of decreased hospital admissions. We had a fairly significant spike on Monday, for example. But being able to sustain the care and adapt and really figure out what that new normal state is going to be within the hospital environment and then within the city environment, especially as some of the social distancing and restrictions really do begin to become relaxed as the world tries to reopen the economy. We're worried that that's going to really cause a resurgence in cases. And so being on guard and not contracting too fast and really being open to when the new patients do come in, if they should, that we'll be able to have the strength, the fortitude, and the clinical teams and care be able to meet them. And I'm confident that we'll be able to rise to that occasion and do it as we have before.
Well, thanks, Brian. You've shown us, I think, this is very much a human and moral side of this, and there are some, I guess, unprecedented changes, right, that you guys have made with the medical students. So I would like to actually turn the microphone to Dr. Chow. Now, Dr. Chow, you were in Wuhan, right, and in the thick of things for 66 days. Now you're back in Beijing. Now, do you see any equivalency in terms of what has happened in Wuhan and Beijing? Because you also manage a very large hospital in Beijing, as well as being the vice dean of the medical school, right? What has that been like from your point of view?
Okay, thank you for organizing this platform to share the experience between the United States and China. And we go through this pandemic and sure have a lot of thinking about this whole procedure. Yeah, actually, I'm working in the Peking University Third Hospital, and this the #1 outpatient clinic in Beijing city. Every day, my hospital have 13,000 to 15,000 outpatient clinic. So actually, every winter, we focus on the fever, flu, what's happened for that because in our hospital is really crowded with population there. And this winter, yeah, we do more about that. Before I go into Wuhan, our hospital already have a 10 patient diagnosis. But in Beijing, we already have a designated hospital. When the general hospital have the patient just transferred to the designated hospital. So my meaning as in Beijing is quickly response for the everything. In the early of January, we already heard about this kind of unexplained pneumonia. So we monitor that, and any suspected patients, we just do the screen at that time. So before the China's festival, we already do a lot of job about that. So it's different because Beijing is a core area, is capital. But Wuhan is the key area at this moment. Professor Zhong and Professor Zhang already talking about that. And all public places in Wuhan are closed and all patients are isolated at home. Actually, what I mostly felt is really Wuhan as a hero city, because the doctor first find the suspected novel coronavirus infection patient and report that, and January 21st hit the pause button. That's look down the city. I believe it's a very, very, very difficult decision for the city. When I arrived there, February 1st, the empty city compared past prosperous city. I've been there several times. Yeah, it's very beautiful city, but this time I feel sorrowful and pathetic at that time. It's really difficult. But at capital, Beijing is also a key area, of course, for the epidemic prevention and control. And in order to effectively reduce the gathering of people and stop the spreading of the epidemic at the beginning of the outbreak, except to the epidemic prevention and control and urban operation and people's usual livelihood industry, as well as other important national economic and people's livelihood related enterprise or other employee of enterprise and public institute will require at work at home through internet, like the most country now, and also working in different time region with health flexible to minimize the cross. For the key or high risk group, implant home isolation and community monitoring and management. But Wuhan, as I mentioned, is difficult, and for prevention, the Wuhan, Hubei to other province and firmly prevent the spreading and export of the epidemic, and stretching the prevention and control of weak area, and a solution ensure that all suspected are made. And even sacrifice are great, but sure, it's not enough at that time. So, so many patients coming. I remember February 1st, it's about 2,000 patients waiting to enter the hospital. That's as infection patient, at that time, most as a critical patient. So no hospital have enough beds, enough medical staff there. So that's the reason as president of the Peking University's hospital, and also include our another 2 general hospital. We are 3 hospitals belong to the Peking University, go to Wuhan. Actually, during 1 month, about 324 teams coming to Wuhan to help the Wuhan. Divided the patient actually 2 main part. One as the mobile camping hospital, the male patient treatment, and others that's the ours mean to treat the critical hospital. When I arrived here, I arrived Wuhan. I know that's a very important. Because one hospital responsible for 1 ICU treatment unit, that's including the 50 beds to that. So our one beds including 1 ward including 15 beds and 100 nurse, 30 doctors responsible for that. So whole day, so very quickly enlarge the ward from 1 to 3 to 6, like our team, but many teams do the same things. So quickly from the situation, we could difficult to get 1 bed transferred to the beds waiting for the patient. Just nearly 1 month from we arrived 2 weeks, just changing the situation. And 1 month, we're waiting for the patient. Yeah, at that time, we hope more patient transferred to our treatment unit. We can treat more patient, and then we can quickly finish work, and then we can back Beijing, back home at that time. But I believe the situation is better and better. So the April 6th, we're back Beijing. We are so happy. Yeah, Jasmine get the battle when at that special period. And so in January, actually in Wuhan, we can summary into the 4th stage. And before before the first stage, before the lockdown, actually, COVID-19 was spread rapidly. And the second stage is from January 23rd to the early February, the city was sealed off. And the central government and provincial government provide the medical supply and dispatch the medical team like us to there, give the assistance, and also gradually give enough the PPE to protect the medical doctor. So that's very, very important at that time, the shortage extremely for the PPE, and then we can work well and also can keep the 0 infection for the medical staff. Is very, very difficult. And the 3rd stage is during February to March. Like I mentioned, a lot of ICU was building to cure severe and critical cases. And also many Fang hospital, shared hospital was building of that. So the shortage of medical resource and the PPE have been relieved quickly as the key point at that time can solve the problem. So on March 18, there were no new suspected or confirmed cases in Wuhan. And the 4th stage is since April 8th, Wuhan has been restarted and all people have started to run into normal life and work as usual. That time I'm being Beijing, isolated in Yanqing, as very beautiful countryside outside Beijing. Our medical staff in the team, all tears, you know, yeah, we so we think it's a very, very important and can get this kind of the final result. So summary, the biggest lesson from Wuhan experience as in this epidemic is all cases should be screening, find out, and treated in such a strict management strategy. And never forget the principle for the controlling the infection disease, and also control the resource of infection and cut off the transmission routine, and protect vulnerable people, and need everybody's try our best and also help each other.
Thanks,
Okay.
Dr. Chow. I think it's very clear from your description, like that this is a very emotional journey for you personally and for your team to travel from Beijing to Wuhan and now back to Beijing and still going through your normal life. I mean, this has or will continue to, I think, change all of us, right, in our professional and our personal lives now. I mean, Barry, a lot of people have started using the term new normal, and it is like the theme of this webinar today. Right? Now, as we look forward to the months and perhaps even years ahead, right? Like what will actually dictate what this new normal will look like? Like, what are the decisions that will be made by leaders around the world and also by individuals, right? That will actually determine what this new normal will look like.
First, let me say it's an honor and a pleasure to be invited. And I really have little to add to the wonderful medical presentations and experiences of all of the other speakers. What I was asked to think about is what is the world likely to look like after COVID is in most places no longer peaking, but under some degree of control or eliminated. And Alex, if I could show the first PowerPoint.
Yeah.
I've given that some thought, and my sense is that COVID is a pivotal event in what will be perhaps the new normal. And if you could move to the next slide and then the next. You do the next? Next, please. So a long time ago, after many years in working in global health, I've come to the very simple view. Previous one, please. Go back one, please. That basically all healthcare is local. People relate to their communities, their local hospitals. Again, could we go back, please? But health research, the new knowledge, could we go back one, please? Is absolutely global. And that has certain requirements that we are at a pivotal moment where the future, in my view, is very unclear. Every country in this world will have had COVID by the end of this year, probably. And that's a shared experience that each country in a different way, but also in a similar way, has had to face. And the question is, will it motivate us to renew multinational global cooperation in healthcare and health research? And hopefully, if we can establish and maintain exchange of information, transparency, circulation of knowledge and data in the realm of health and public health, that's perhaps the stimulus to do sharing of ideas and thoughts and collaboration beyond even epidemiology, public health, and medicine. I have to give thanks to my colleagues and many friends in the early days of this who published the DNA sequence or the cDNA sequence so that every country in the world could create diagnostic tests, of the publications from the NIHs that describe the disease so any clinician in the world could recognize COVID if it walked into their door, and my colleagues in Hong Kong who presented the models that told the world that this was going to be a pandemic by the 28th of January that would probably, unless we intervene, go around the world. And that's the kind of openness and sharing of data that has made possible a global effort that we are engaged in at the moment to develop drugs and vaccines and greater knowledge. The alternative is that the world would become more polarized with a nationalist competition between the US or China or Asia or European countries. And that competition may have certain values, but not in the realm of global health and global knowledge. And I am concerned that unless the health community and many other academic communities share our efforts and commitment to working together, there will be a fragmentation of science that will not be helpful. May I have the next one, please? So what, in my view, will the new world look like? And I think that this epidemic has, at least in our country, which is the only one at the moment can speak about with any confidence, it has created concerns that this richest, most prosperous country in the world has never had to face since the Great Depression in the 1930s. There will be continuing concerns, in my view, about infection, whether it is COVID coming back in the fall, whether COVID becomes a seasonal disease, whether we have a new strain of influenza that arises to which we are not partially immune. I think we will have a public concern for many years about health security and infectious diseases. And I think that will reinforce already existing concerns about cybersecurity, of being spied upon, of having our private conversations in the social media picked up and misused, and threats to privacy, and will raise the question, what are trusted information sources? I would like to believe the world would believe that the most trusted, or one of the most trusted, is that of science. But we do not always have friends that support and trust science, but they can be very damaging to the efforts of science and the efforts to create trust in science. I think the issue of climate change, which will have many manifestations in weather, once again will make people insecure about living near water, of whether there will be floods, whether crops will die off, whether there'll be droughts. And we haven't had to worry about that in a practical sense. It was once an academic discussion. It will become a very real concern that people will carry with them. And finally, one of the consequences of the shutdowns, whether in Wuhan or New York, is many jobs are being created or changed so that many industries that have workers who've gotten ill and have stopped the ability to have companies, particularly manufacturing, continue, will begin to put in more and more automation, which will threaten the jobs of people, both in my country and in perhaps other places around the world. So there will be a continuing level of insecurity about many areas of life that probably wouldn't have happened, at least in the time frame I anticipate, without COVID. At the same time, we will not go back to where we were before, but we will become accustomed to a new world of social distancing, not for 1 month or 2 months. Maybe restaurants will open, but people will have tables farther apart, and schools will have chairs further apart. And social distancing will be released, at least intelligently, in a very gradual way. And the concern is when it is not, as it wasn't in Hong Kong, for example, the epidemic flares up again, and one has to reinstitute social distancing measures, which is hard to do, it's costly, and it becomes very politically unpopular. So getting this right, the appropriate stepwise release of various businesses, something that we can learn from China, and we will have to learn from other parts of our country. People will now be used to repetitive testing, and I feel very strongly the tests we have are totally inadequate for the purpose, and there is a major effort to develop fast 15, 18-minute molecular tests using high-tech stuff that produces color tests like pregnancy tests within 15 or 20 minutes that would be very cheap and can be done every day. There's a major new NIH effort launched 1 week ago to select for the best ideas for changing the way we do testing so it's cheap and fast and sensitive and specific. People will have to be able to walk around for very long periods of time in countries like the US that never wore masks. And there will be resistance to that. And it will not be a pleasant circumstance demanding it of our people. And workplaces are not just places where people could go to sit at their computers, but they will have to test the people who come in and leave to be sure that they are not infected and not putting everyone else in large companies at risk. This will be a new world of continuing testing and social distancing. When China opened Wuhan and relaxed the social distancing and allowed travelers to come in, as you know better than I, almost all the new cases in China, in Hong Kong, in Singapore, with one exception, came from travelers. The ones in Singapore were workers that didn't fly in, but every country is now going to have to be concerned once they reduce the level of this disease of how to prevent it from being reintroduced. And the United States has 50 states, and each of them is different. And health is a state responsibility in America, not a federal one in general. And so if one state does a great job of reducing the numbers, it could be overwhelmed by travelers and visitors in trucks and buses and cars from another state. So we will have to have some constraints and some concerns about travelers over the long haul. We will have a vaccine in perhaps 2 years. It will take another year to get it produced in massive amounts, probably. But then the question is, who gets the vaccines? Who decides that? And for every step with vaccines, as you all know, there is misinformation about vaccines. People will be hesitant to take them, and hence, will we ever get to a level of herd immunity remains unclear. We will live in a level of surveillance, particularly if there are electronic methods for identifying cases that's been used effectively in China and Hong Kong and Korea. That would be new in the United States. There will be resistance to that from people who value their civil liberties. And will we become accustomed to that? And then finally, in the balance that we saw from the very beginning presentation of Professor Zhang, there's a balance between the economy and health. And will we become accepting of a high level of deaths justified by the ability to move the economy? And will that lead to our accepting increasing continued deaths from infection by COVID, just as we accept deaths in many countries with food insecurity and in our country with gun injuries that would be crazy because they're preventable, but people have learned to accept them. Finally, if I could have the last slide, please, Alex. I see some positive changes, not only negative ones. I believe, at least in my country, and I hope in China and other countries, there is a renewed appreciation of what scientists have done to understand, model, predict, and intervene, and create new tools so that the science, public health, and medicine will have a new respect and would become heroes to the public that has not previously really understood what we did. I hope the rush for vaccines and drugs will continue in investments in science for new innovation in all kinds of areas that will make life safer and easier and more rewarding for people. Innovation is the ways to fix the problems of the world, but it's often only invested in after a tragedy or an outbreak or a natural disaster. I think in our country, I'm hopeful that there will be a recognition of what the important work of people we now call essential workers. These are not just academics, professors, CEOs of industry. These are the people who drive the buses and who sell fruit in the fruit market and brought the food in chains into Wuhan in the middle of an epidemic. These are the real heroes within this epidemic. I hope they get recognized in a continuing way and respected and rewarded for their effort. And that includes vulnerable people, particularly people in nursing homes and the elderly who have been enormously vulnerable in this. And finally, realizing that the most vulnerable people, at least in my country, and I would be surprised if it were different in China, are the people at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, the poorest people who live in the most crowded housing, have the fewest resources. And we see those dying in 2 and 3 times a greater rate than those that are more affluent and live in better conditions. And I hope this epidemic will renew a commitment to decrease societal inequities and make it a fairer and more equitable society. So those are my thoughts for the future. I hope some of them are wrong, and I hope some of them are right.
Thanks, Barry. As we look forward to the new normal, sometimes it can be quite gloomy. And thank you for taking us to a more positive spin. Now, actually, as we look at the new normal, I think one of the joke, I'm not sure how big of a joke it is that during lockdown, a lot of people speculate that there will be a lot more COVID babies coming out in 40 weeks' time. Now, I think this is, I guess, one of the scientific unknowns, right? And I actually want to ask a question to Dr. Chow, right? Being a reproductive and maternal child health expert, right? Like, life as we know it will continue. People will continue to have babies, will have births, right? And now I'm sure if pregnant mothers were not already anxious, now with COVID-19, I'm sure they're even more anxious. Like, how much do we actually know about the effects of COVID on pregnancy and on maternal child transmission, for example?
Until now, in our experience and summary from the Wuhan, also whole China, we got the pregnant woman as similar symptoms as the general population, no more severe. So that's lucky. And until now, have nearly 100 women delivery, and the baby is healthy. It's a good news, and have several cases after the delivery become severe, but not critical. So now we see them already recovery back to home. So also it's okay. But for the effect for the reproduction, until now, have a few evidence to show for the ovary, for oocyte, when the ovulation have a ACE2 receptor express, and also for the male reproductive system, maybe have some effect. So now we suggest if have already infection, the COVID-19, better to after 3 months, and best for the half year get the pregnant. And others just observe no severe fever and other symptoms can continue to have the baby. Yeah.
Oh, thanks, Dr. Chow. And I think I was just looking through all the questions. This is live streaming on both Tencent Classroom and also on YouTube. And I was just going through some of the questions. I think there's actually one, there are two very, very common questions that popped up. And I'm going to ask the first one to Dr. Zhong Shan. Is about antibody. Now, hang on a second.
Excuse me. So the voice is not that good, so I cannot catch your question.
Dr. Zhong, so is it really about, you mentioned about herd immunity. Now, of course, we can get to herd immunity with a good, safe, and effective vaccine. Now, there's always been this question on whether natural infection and natural antibody generation equate to protection. Now, do we have any evidence that natural infection will actually lead to infection, which will contribute to the development of herd immunity?
I don't think so. So I think that there's some evidence hundreds of years ago. So like smallpox or polio. So that's a high fatality and very high reproductive number. So the people got the smallpox and then got so in Spain, I suppose, some of them so got quite massive infection in the population. So for several generations, it takes much longer time to get herd immunity by this natural infection. And eventually, it's not that perfect. So if we had developed a smallpox vaccine, and then everybody should receive a smallpox vaccine during the newborn, so or childhood, and then get the immunity. So I don't think the herd immunity will be achieved by that way. Other than now, after several hundred years and several decades, so our technique is pretty much improved. So I think nowadays we need to develop a vaccine. Of course, vaccine is not that simple. So the most domestic vaccination maybe 1 or 1.5 years, but in terms of the massive vaccination, or so, and looking at the so-called ADE or some others, so we'll be taking much more time to get it. But anyway, we need to develop a vaccine. So in emergent, in particular, collaboration. I really appreciate that Barry just now mentioned the sentence. So all healthcare is local, or all healthcare is global. I really appreciate this sentence. This is why we have a close consideration in between Guangzhou Institute of Healthcare, Respiratory Health, and the Harvard Medical School. We have already had a discussion discussed for 11 times. So in terms of different topic and how we can cooperate from each other, and then all the things. I suppose even in terms of vaccine, I'm not very much concerned about who will be the first to develop vaccine. I'm very much concerned about which vaccine will be more effective in terms of safety and efficacy. So that will be a good collaboration between countries. And then we will have a much better vaccine to contribute to the mankind, the things. So in going back to your questions, I suppose the herd immunity can only be achieved by vaccination, massive vaccination. It will take time. It will even take several years to further confirm whether this vaccination will be effective or not.
Great, thanks, Dr. Zhong. So I think it's clear that, I think the end game for us against COVID-19 is a vaccine, and how we can balance it. I think the next question for the new normal for us will be if there is actually one or hopefully multiple vaccine candidates become available. I think then there will be a lot of discussion around supplies and prioritization of these supplies, not only across countries, but also within the countries, to the point that Barry mentioned, right? Which are the subpopulation that we should protect first? The most vulnerable, like healthcare work, the high-risk healthcare workers, the most vulnerable people. But I'm sure this will actually create I think more tension to come, and I think this is one where I think all the researchers do have to work together, right, to actually overcome this. Now, there's also a theme of question. One quick question I want to ask, probably directly to Brian. As you are really managing the front line and the workload, right? I think various sort of states, including New York, has talked about sort of reopening the lockdown with different types of activities being proposed, right? Given the risk, right? What do you foresee any issues with the current plan about the discussion about reopening New York?
Well, I think because they're opening New York State up in regions, and so New York City, which is certainly the epicenter, and with Queens, the Bronx, Manhattan, of the boroughs within the city, having the highest concentrations within the country, and then the surrounding areas, it's really going to be phased. And in New York City and the surrounding suburbs are going to be opened up much later. And I think it needs to be done in a very cautious and stepwise manner. Part of it is the reduction in cases and monitoring that, and then also the testing and the contact tracing. And a question actually that I have, because Barry mentioned and Sen even mentioned at the beginning, and they've been doing it more in China, these contact tracings, which I think are going to be an important component. How does that work, and how do people deal with that threat to their own privacy that Barry, that you talked about? Because that really is something that, if your phone beeps that you've come in contact with somebody who is at risk or is positive, how does that impact on a society?
Well, I guess the contact tracing will be key for us going forward. I think both Google and Apple has developed initiative to try to actually balance the need to contact trace and to protect the privacy. I think this is again a very contentious issue, and we have seen Europe and different countries have taken very different approaches to this. China, of course, has developed the health code digitally, right, to actually allow people to move and travel while knowing what their quote unquote their health risk and status is. And otherwise, I think part of the burden that we do not want to add to is the overstretch CDC workload already across the globe to contact trace. This is literally like herding cats when a lot of the time we actually don't know what the cat looks like. We can't find the cat most of the time, and the cats sometimes look different. Now, I believe our time is up. Now, I think we do have a lot more questions than answers. And I think, to borrow Barry's quote, right, all healthcare is local, all health research is global. And I think this is one of the reasons why the organizers has formed the GACC, the Global Alliance to Combat COVID-19. And this is the first of many webinars to come. Now, first, I would like to express my gratitude to all of our speakers today. Please stay tuned for our next webinar, and let's work together as a global threat against COVID-19 for humanity. So thank you, everyone, for participating, and thank you very much to everyone who's tuning in.
Great. To have a nice sleep.
Thank you. Yeah, have a safe day.
谢谢。